Welcome and thank you for joining us on a conversation about the feelings factor, unraveling emotion and moral psychology in politics, part of the Eagleton Institute of Politics Gambaccini Civic Engagement Series. I am Yalidy Matos, an associate professor of political science at Rutgers University. The Louis J. Gambaccini Civic Engagement Series was designed to promote civic engagement through an annual discussion of timely and enduring issues of great significance, with the objective of generating real civil discourse and action. The program was established through the generous support of Lou Gambaccini's family, friends, and colleagues to honor his outstanding legacy in public service and his lifelong dedication to upholding the highest standards of civic responsibility, always striving and inspiring others to leave communities better and more beautiful than they found them. We'd like to thank the following sponsors that helped support today's conversation: the Women's Rights Law Reporter, Institute for Women's Leadership, and the Political Science Graduate Student Association. As our distinguished panelist today, we have with us Jane Coaston. Jane Coaston is a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times with a special interest in American conservatism. She has written on topics including QAnon, college admissions scandals, evangelicalism in America, and elections. She is also the host of the popular New York Times podcast, The Argument, which offers context, analysis, and good faith engagement on current political debates. She has recently joined CNN as an on-air contributor for the Chris Wallace Show and other CNN shows. Jane was formerly a senior politics reporter at Vox, covering current events spanning from the Republican Party to the Black Lives Matter movement. Her work has appeared on MSNBC, CNN, ABC News, NPR, The Ringer, BuzzFeed, and The Washington Post. And she has written for publications ranging from ESPN Magazine to the National Review. She is a graduate of the University of Michigan, holding a BA in history and political science with a focus on World War. Before we get started, we'd like to invite attendees to use the chat function to submit their questions throughout the seminar. I'm excited to engage with Jane today and look forward to the conversation, especially as we have the upcoming election coming in November. And so given today's title, The Feelings Factor, I think I'd like to start there, Jane. You've written about something around emotions, the politics of feelings, or the feelings factor. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is? What is the feelings factor? How are feelings intimately involved in politics today, and how voters use them to make decisions?
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me, and greetings from Los Angeles. I think that when I think about feelings in politics, I think that feelings are such an effective director for our politics. I think that too often we think that our politics are based on facts and logic, and our opposition's politics are based on feelings. I think that there's a real sense that feelings in politics are bad. But I think that we can all recognize that there are moments in which we can look at polling data or statistics about the economy, and we're like, yes, I'm sure that's true, but it doesn't feel true. I think for younger viewers, you may have think of this as like vibes, the idea that the vibes are bad or the vibes are weird in our politics. That's feelings. And so I think it's really important for us to acknowledge and respect the place that feelings play in our politics. Feelings are why so often people have very bad opinion of Congress, but they like their specific congressperson. People often will say that, America is on the wrong track, and yet we are due to have a repeat of the 2020 election with the same two people running for president. I think that feelings play a really important part because a lot of times our feelings are not based on our general surroundings or on our national context. They're based on how we are interpreting our surroundings and our national context. And I think that that's a really important way to understand how we are thinking about current events. That might mean that your personal economy might be good, but you see something taking place in your city or in your neighborhood that you haven't seen before that you don't like. So even if your personal economy is good and the economy writ large seems good, you might be thinking, but it doesn't look the way I want it to. That's feelings, but that's also a perfectly normal way to interpret events. So I think that the relationship between feelings and how we interpret politics really can't be understated, because that's how we're doing it. No one really is thinking about their politics through the cold lens of fact. People will say they sometimes are, but they aren't. I think that taking our feelings into concern, I think, is so important to understand how our politics actually work and how we get to the policies we want to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. These little gut vibes that we get are often feelings. And so if people are often doing politics, performing politics, making decisions about politics based on feelings, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of that, right? So if feelings are not necessarily all about facts, may they be manipulated? Can we look at them through a more advantageous perspective?
Yeah, I think that we are thinking about how I think that there can be a real advantage to thinking about our feelings. I think that too often we think of feelings as being a detriment to our politics, that our politics would be better without feelings involved, but also our politics wouldn't be politics. Let's keep in mind that politics is just the journey on which we're going to get to policy. And policy is just figuring out how groups of people can interact with one another in order to, get a road. I'm looking outside. I'm thinking about the politics of getting the road outside my hotel, how to get that constructed. I'm thinking about the politics that it took to get this university, the University of Southern California, where I'm teaching, how that was constructed. Those were all policy decisions that were the result of politics, that were the result of people. Let's keep in mind that, politics, policy, all of this idea comes from the polis, the populace, the people. And people are based in many ways on feelings. Our feelings about what do we want a university to look like. A university could look just kind of like a mall, but people don't generally want a university that looks like a mall. People want a university that looks like a university. That's a feelings concept. And so I think that it's just so important for us to think about, like, trying to take feelings out of politics would be taking the people out of politics.
Yeah. And I know you've written about feelings on the right and the left, right? Like a conservative feelings factor, but also that it exists on the left. Can you tell us a little bit about how feelings are used both on the right by conservatives as well as liberals and Democrats?
I think it's interesting because I think that simultaneously we see on both sides a denial of feelings, but also an embrace of feelings. And I'll explain what they mean, or what I mean. I think we see often, for instance, Democrats will talk about being the party of science. There are some right-wing influencers who have that idea of facts don't care about your feelings. Both of these are ways to say that, no, we're not doing this based on how we feel. We're not doing this based on vibes. We're doing this based on solid facts, but no one is. They just aren't. And I think that we even see there's kind of a right-wing current, atmosphere, especially online, of arguing that feelings are feminine and that, masculine people focus on facts. But then we also see an embrace of feelings when it comes to the right with regard to how afraid we should be of migrants or immigrants or undocumented immigrants, which, with regard to the facts of, say, what crime rates look like with regard to undocumented immigrants, you'll kind of get get a response from someone like, oh, it doesn't feel that way. And on the left, there's the idea of looking at a policy and saying, like, what is the human cost of this policy? How do I feel about this policy? That's feelings. And so I think that also there really is a sense that you need to deny feelings and deny the role of feelings if you're to be an objective arbiter of politics. But both sides simultaneously argue that their feelings are correct and important and should be embraced and primaced in our politics.
Yeah. Do you see a future where, this sort of atmosphere of party polarization, do you see a future where both sides feel like their feelings are important and being embraced? And what would that look like?
No. Nope. Because I think that it actually, there is no, okay, the two most popular messages in politics are, you are correct, but also simultaneously your views are very interesting and dangerous. And the idea that only I, as the party, as the politician, as the media outlet, am listening to your feelings. No one else cares about your feelings except me. So if we had a politics in which people felt like their feelings were being hurt, I think we would have to redesign what we think of as politics. Because the idea of your feelings not being cared about or heard is such an effective political message that it doesn't even matter if it's true. You think about how people think, we hear all the time about the views and feelings of Americans on any number of subjects. And people, there are companies where all they do is that type of polling that is about how Americans feel about various subjects. In terms of how, Americans are more heard than they have ever been, perhaps in our history. And yet they will still be told that no one is listening to you. And then they will respond by saying, no one is listening to me. And I think what they're saying is, no one is taking my feelings and making a policy that I get to enjoy out of my feelings. But I do think that there will not be a time in which everyone, Americans feel en masse as if their feelings are being heard. Because I think that the idea is not being heard. The idea is being, and I mean this not to say that like Americans are big jerks, but I think that there's a sense of it's not about being heard, it's about being obeyed. Like, their feelings are not being put into policies that they get to live under. Their feelings are not being enacted into law. That's the difference. I think that's, in some ways, people are saying, I'm not being heard, I'm not being listened to, is that I am not being reflected in politics and policy, for whatever that might mean.
Yeah. So you mentioned two factors I wanted to get into. The role of elites and also the role of media. And so when it comes to elites, do you have a sense of, you talked a little bit about how elites can also have this discourse of like, you, my constituents, you're not being heard, your feelings doesn't matter, the other side doesn't care about your feelings. So that's kind of one way in which they have a role in this sort of feelings factors. Do you have a sense of that is changing with like more the younger elites, a more diverse representation of elites? Do you feel like they're doing something different, maybe better?
Well, I think first we need to define what we mean when we talk about elites. And I've written about this before. There is no less popular thing to be than an elite. And so we see routinely people who are elites attempting to foist the label off on someone else. And so you'll see Senator Josh Hawley, for example, who is a member of the Senate, who attended elite universities, is personally wealthy, and once taught at an elite boys' school in England, talking about the elites of the people who are unionizing who work at Starbucks. And so I think that it's important to think about are we talking about elite as a class, elite as, say, people who make over $250,000 a year? Because in that case, we might not necessarily be talking about people with college educations. We might not necessarily be talking about people who went to elite universities. If we talk about elite as a class and we're thinking about that purely economically, then we're probably talking about a different group of people than even the people who fit that category would say. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago talking about how, where I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the elites were not people who went to Harvard and Yale. The elites were the people who owned like a Toyota dealership and went on vacation twice a year to go to Destin in Florida. And so they would never think of themselves as being elite. But I believe that there was a Great Atlantic piece that kind of talked about them as being kind of our elite, like the elite landowners of the Midwest. The people who have multiple cars and they live in really nice homes and they go on vacations, but they don't think of themselves as being elite because they didn't go to Harvard. And they're looking at people who live in New York as being elite. So it's important really to get our terminology straight. But I also think that what we're seeing now is an interesting reflection in which people want to perform. And I mean this, attempting to think about this objectively. People want to perform talking about the feelings of people they perceive to be not elites while being elites. And here's what I mean. In a lot of, I think, left-leaning spaces, there is an effort to primacy the feelings of non-white people, of sexual minorities, of people who may have less access to those spaces. But at the same time, the people who are even getting into that space in the first place, if you're at a major university or you are at a Fortune 500 company, already you're part of a select group of people. You might be a minority within that group, or you might be a representative of a traditionally marginalized community, but you are still, you're still working at Apple. You're still attending Yale. It's going to be a different experience. And so I think that in some ways, yes, how people are interpreting the feelings of younger people or people from different communities, I think that there has been more of an effort to talk about what those feelings look like. But I think that so much of that effort, to me, and this is just my view, so much of that effort, again, primacies people who have access to those spaces in the first place. For instance, I'm sure if you've been a non-white person in the world, you've seen the idea of like, as a X or Y, or this person is a leader in the Black community. And I always think about like, we don't have meetings. And if we do, I was not invited to any of them. But there's this idea of like, as a blah, 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 I get to speak on behalf of all of these people. But those people aren't in the room with you. Those people may not have gotten access to the room. Those people might not even care about the issue at hand because they have other things to do. And so I think that, yes, there is more of an effort from young people from marginalized communities to think about feelings in a really smart way. But in the same way, they're still limited by the fact that it's just so difficult to get advantage of the feelings of all young people or all people from marginalized communities. I think that can be really challenging. And I think that so often it's so challenging that people don't really try, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, as we're talking about feelings and emotions, what are some of the concrete feelings or emotions that you see out there? What are some of the top ones that you see as being really the treading sort of politics?
I would say, I think top of mind, the first thing that came to me is doomerism. And this is also kind of a pet peeve of mine. But there is a sense, and you get it a lot online. So it's really worth saying that like part of this is an online phenomenon that feeds on itself. You hear people talking about how like, oh, this is the worst time in human history. Things have never been worse. Everything's terrible. And if you try to tell them that actually that's not true, that actually probably the worst time in human history was like 536 AD. Like there's actually been studies to show that like that is the culmination of all of the worst things, including a weather event that meant that like people didn't see the sun for a full year. Like there's actual showing that now is actually pretty great. And I really embrace the idea that things have generally improved throughout human history and will continue to do so. But that's not a very popular message. Doomerism has a tendency to feed on itself, and it rejects any efforts at optimism. We've seen and there's actually been journalistic studies showing that doomers and being negative are perceived as being more realistic or smarter. That people who are more negative are perceived as being smarter, which I think is telling but stupid. But I do think you see like this feeling of everything is terrible, everything is bad. That is something that I think permeates our culture. I think is really dangerous, especially because I think that in some ways you're seeing it from people. There was a great Politico piece about a specific Trump supporter, and it was something about how he was like, oh, I just want to blow up the entire system. I just want to blow up the entire system and destroy everything. This is a person who had a really, a nice, comfortable life. He had a happy family. He had, built a fair amount of wealth, and yet he had embraced this kind of doomerism in which anything would be better than the life that he lived right then, which is actually fine. And I don't think he really wanted to blow up his own life. I think that so often people want to, what they're seeking is a release from boredom. And, fear is, I guess, not boring. But I do think that kind of doomerism feeling is something that is, that permeates. I think it's even more so than anger, because I think that there are lots of ways to be righteously angry. But I think that doomerism permeates and perpetuates itself. The idea that things are terrible all the time. And even if you're given statistics about how things have gotten better, like there's an idea of like, no, but it doesn't feel that way. And so I think that would be my answer, is that doomerism. Doomerism is endemic.
Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned the role of media, and especially with social media. Like, is there a way that we can use, social media to sort of like combat this doomerism?
Well, the problem is the first word, obviously, in social media is social. And societal interactions, I think, unintentionally promote doomerism. And social media tends to have what I would call an algorithmically doomerizing influence. And I'll explain what I mean. Right now, if you go to X, formerly Twitter, and you can go to For You, which is what algorithmically has been picked for you to see. And it is never, here's a good thing that happened that doesn't really matter, but is a cool thing that you could know about. It never is. It's just like, here's a terrible thing that happened somewhere. You should hear about it. And I think that there used to be this issue on YouTube. And I was told by YouTube at the time that they had fixed this. And so far I've seen some evidence of that. I don't see it as often. But it used to have this effect in which, like, let's just say that you set autoplay on videos, and you started with videos about race walking, which is a formerly an Olympic sport. If you started with like how to start race walking, eventually the YouTube algorithm would get you towards ultramarathons. The YouTube algorithm would really had an extremism bent. Not extremism as in just like becoming a terrorist, but as extremism as like, you started out with walking and now you're at ultramarathons. You started out with like, hill climbs, you get to Everest. And so I think that the problem that social media has is that there is no extremism to optimism. You really, like, at a certain point, there's about as optimistic as you can be, and that's pretty much the ceiling. You really can't, there's no bottom. There's no, the end of the whale of doomerism is, I don't even know where it is. Like, that's blackpilling, to use the internet term. Like, I think that that's the challenge, is that I think that social media's extremism tendencies will always go in a doomer direction. That's just how it is. Like, there's no happiness extremism. That's just not how people work. And so I think that social media will always be inherently negative because people will always interact with others in that platform in a way that is going to, despite their own best efforts, people always are putting out, my Instagram right now is a lot of like fitness videos and videos of dogs. And I love both of those things. But I do think that when social media is interacting between people, there is a tendency towards a kind of doomerism spiral that I think that I just think that it's not even social media's fault. It's, the social part. It's us.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And the extremism part of that, like I had never really thought about it. You start with one thing and then you're like ending up, building a home after you searched, how to put up a shelf. So that's a really interesting perspective. A little bit earlier, you mentioned maybe a little bit of what your thoughts are around, even if we have, younger elected elites or more diverse elected elites, even within that discourse, right? It can be quite elitist, right? So that the mass public is still not feeling heard, or that their feelings matter, because even though they might have descriptive representation, there's a gap between themselves and particular elites. I wanted to know what other role do you see sort of like race and ethnicity playing in these sort of like feelings factor, or how it's being used or manipulated, or how racial subjects are sort of intersecting with feelings and emotions.
I think that there's a really important piece of this, especially when we talk about racism. I think that there is a real sense to me that when having conversations about race and identity, that we're actually having conversations about our own feelings regarding our own interactions with other people, our own perceptions of those people. And those perceptions are not going to often be based on firsthand experience because, they can't be. You can't have a firsthand experience of every other person who's a member of a different racial group. That's insane. But I do think that, how we think about racism, that's a feeling. And racism is a series of feelings upon which people attempt to build the superstructure of random ideas or facts or interpretations of data based on a feeling. I think often about how in the 1920s, 1930s, there was a stereotype about Jewish people, that Jewish people were inherently good at basketball because they were wily or crafty. And that's what being good at basketball required. And that Black people would be bad at basketball because they weren't smart enough to figure it out. And that's, in the 1920s and 1930s, there were legendary Jewish basketball players, especially in New York. Some of the smaller universities in New York had NCAA major victories against who we would think of as being institutional powers. And the idea was that it was because of the power of Jewish basketball players. And then, we see cut 30 years later, 40 years later, and then you have a stereotype that, Black people are only good at basketball because of their physical prowess and because they're also tall and athletic or something like that. None of this is based on any actual information. Jewish people did not stop playing basketball or stop being good at basketball. Black people did not start being good at basketball. All of these stereotypes, all of this racial animus was based on weird feelings and vibes that people invented that now looking back seem kind of ridiculous. The idea that people would just be Jewish people, they're good at basketball. And just thinking en masse, what was there a tournament? And so I think a lot about how those feelings impact how we see ourselves and impact how we see other people. But that's what racism and even some of our racial discourse is based on feelings. it's based on an idea, a feeling that this person might be more dangerous, or this person might be smarter, or this person might be better at X or Y. Those are feelings. Those aren't facts.
Yeah. And so what happens when feelings become the foundation of structures?
I mean, I think that they already are. They are. There are a lot of people who want to believe that there was some sort of halcyon time before we used feelings in politics or structures and policy building, but there wasn't. Like, so much of our country is created on the basis not of like, this would be the best thing to put in this place because of data or math or something like that, but because of feelings. Feelings are when people protest apartment buildings because they put a shadow over a park. Those are feelings. Those are not facts. And so I think that we can see the basis of so much of our policy has always been feelings.
Okay, I think we may have time for two more of my questions, and then we'll open it up to attendees. So just make sure that you submit your questions through the Q&A section or forum. Okay, so in thinking about these ideas of feelings, right? Of course, we can have positive feelings, we can have negative feelings. You've just described to us, race and racism are sort of like a series of feelings that people then act on and build structures based on. So tell me a little bit about what the consequences for democracy are when voters are making decisions purely based on feelings and emotions, or when political elites manipulate voters' emotions or feelings. Like, tell me a little bit about how, we've seen a lot of sort of like conversations around misinformation or disinformation. Like, what are the consequences for democracy when we purely think about making decisions based on feelings, or when elites manipulate those?
Well, I think that the challenge in answering your question is that we've never had a politics where that wasn't true. We've just never done it. I think back to Woodrow Wilson's re-election campaign slogan was, in 1916, was, "He kept us out of war." And then, for totally understandable reasons, and I say this as someone who hates former President Woodrow Wilson with the fire of 1,000 suns, he then entered the United States, for many reasons, into the First World War. But the feeling was, and there's an argument that he wanted the United States to enter the First World War, and that a lot of other people did too. But the feeling was that Americans did not want to enter the First World War. And we see in the 1930s, we see that Americans did not want to enter the Second World War at all. There was a feeling that Europe's problems were Europe's problems. So many men had died in the First World War. And let's keep in mind also that the United States' involvement in the First World War was comparatively short and comparatively less painful than it would have been for the United Kingdom, for example. But we see a feeling in the 1930s that, isolationism is the best path forward. And I think that even our response to isolationism, and we see this today, is a feeling. I personally oppose isolationism and an isolationist foreign policy, but I'm not doing that based on the data reflects this, but it's a feeling. And so our politics have always reflected feelings, and our politics have always been manipulated based on those feelings. You can think of any number of historic examples, even the growth of advertising and the use of advertising in politics. There's the famous Daisy ad from the 1964 presidential campaign that implies that if you don't vote for Lyndon Baines Johnson, you are going to be facing nuclear war and the death of everyone on Earth. You see this in 1968. Nixon's use of the idea of the silent majority, the idea that he alone can end the chaos in cities, even cities that you don't live in. And going back a little bit to the Prohibition era, it's a feeling that there is something wrong in the cities, and the thing that is wrong with the cities are immigrants, which leads to immigration restrictions in 1924, but also alcohol. And the perceptions of what prohibition meant were very different between rural areas and urban areas. But that's a side story. So it's not like we have had this era of politics that had good information and good feelings, and people were thinking carefully. No, that we've just never done that. David Duke didn't nearly become governor of Louisiana because people were using intelligent data and thoughtful analysis. He nearly became governor of Louisiana because he managed to say what a lot of people felt, even if they didn't want to say that they felt that. And so David Duke, being the former Grand Wizard, once again, Grand Wizard, ridiculous term. And so I think that too often, and I think that we see this a lot in academic circles, there's an idea like starting in 2014, 2015, our politics became feelings dominated, and there's too much misinformation, and the misinformation has taken advantage of the feelings of voters and contributed to a sentiment of chaos and disorder. And I think misinformation is a big problem. I think that too often we want to say that misinformation is coming from like some other giant source, but the misinformation often is coming from people like us, not just people in the media, but just people in general. But I think that we have always been a feelings-dominated political culture. We are a political culture in which we have. You can think of some of the stalwarts of our earliest political era, spending the election of 1800 yelling at each other and accusing each other of affairs. You can think about the politics of and the feelings of the 1830s and 1840s, the so-called era of good feeling, when, obviously it was dominated in some part by debates over the Patriot States and slavery, but there was this idea of like the vibes were good under Andrew Jackson, which is a funny thing now to think about, knowing more about Andrew Jackson. But like feelings are our politics, because feelings are based on, how we interact with one another. And so is our politics. Politics is the path we go on to get policy, but this is all still based on people who have a lot of feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And people are complicated. They can have feelings and contradictory feelings all at the same time. So as my last question before we open it up for Q&A, what can we do as voters and lay people? How do we, is the end goal to make more informed, less feelings-based decisions, or is the end goal to make more informed, feelings-based, but more democratic decisions? Like what can we do as voters?
I think that the best thing we can do as voters is be honest. Our politics are inherently feelings-based because our feelings are that's what it comes. Feelings are what make us human in many respects. And so I think that just being honest about where those are drawing you to, and being willing to examine your own feelings about a specific issue or a specific candidate, thinking about, how is that influencing your vote? What do you need to do? How can you learn more about something that feels, if you take examination of your own feelings. Don't be afraid to read something that riles you up or angers you, because it can maybe help you understand your own feelings about a specific issue. And I'm not saying that's going to change how you vote. You might come to the culmination of the idea of like, oh, I was correct the whole time. But I think that really examining your feelings about voting and about who you're voting for and what you're voting for, I think that that's a really important way to think about, what you can do on behalf of democracy is be honest.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much. This is really great conversation. There's some really great questions on the Q&A chat. And this one kind of goes a little bit to my last question, but I thought this person put it really well. And they said that we should embrace feelings as an inevitable part of our politics. but how do you imagine a path forward in distinguishing between productive feelings like hope and feelings that fuel harmful perspectives like xenophobia? And so you talked a little bit just about that, but then like if the outcome is the same, aren't we in the same place? Like if somebody can't distinguish between, oh, I feel all these feelings towards immigrants and xenophobia, and I'm going to look it up and find information that agrees with what I already think. And so I was correct the whole time. And so I'm going to continue to do what I do.
Right. I think that's why it's so important to find counter information and to challenge your own feelings, which no one enjoys doing. I'm not saying anyone is going to have a good time doing any of this. It's a bad time, you won't like it. But I think that it's really important to do that. I think that too often, I am not saying that we should, primacy our own feelings. What I am saying is that we need to be honest about our own feelings and challenge them, especially on specific issues that we feel really strongly about. Find counter evidence, examine that counter evidence, recognize that your feelings matter, but your feelings are countered by the feelings of someone who is literally the exact political opposite of you and still like a member of society just like you. But I think it's just really important to take advantage of the information that you can gain, and also, don't be afraid to challenge your feelings. Your feelings are not actually, the facts are not, facts don't care about your feelings, but facts actually care quite a bit about feelings. We've seen so often, there's a Talking Heads song where, David Byrne writes that facts don't do what I want them to. I think that too often our politics have just become people spouting facts at one another with the feeling that that should do something, like some sort of magical spell. But what facts do is often inform our feelings, but then often our feelings inform the facts. With regard to polling data, for example. But I just think that, so all of this comes down to challenge your own feelings. If you feel as if immigration is a massive, giant problem or something like that, or unchecked immigration, challenge those feelings and talk to people who challenge you and follow people on the internet who challenge you, even if you're angry at them the whole time. But don't tell them that you're angry with them the whole time, because that's really annoying. But I think really examining those feelings and taking those feelings into account, recognizing what they are, which is feelings. Too often I see people who treat their feelings as if they are a factual understanding of the world. There's a person who once was a kind of well-known thinker and critic, but over the last, I'd say, 10 years, I think she has become known a bit of as a crank. And so she routinely will tweet things like, has anyone even seen a pregnant woman since 2020? And then all of her responses were like, yes? What? That her feeling is that, like, no, that doesn't happen anymore. We're all dying out. It's all awful. And it's like, she will be confronted with facts and figures about like actual birth rates and actual information. But her general view is like, well, my feelings tell me that this is not real. And so, challenge your own feelings, because often your feelings have something to do with something that has nothing to do with the facts at hand. But also recognize that we direct where facts go. Facts are the culmination of research that was directed by feelings. So be aware of your feelings and put them into the proper context, and don't be afraid to challenge them, but don't ever think that you're going to get away from them in our politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think part of maybe what you were saying earlier is sort of in terms of your personal identities. I took the person's question about identity politics to be more so about racial, ethnic, gendered identities, those kinds of meta categories. Is the danger, which I think may be part of your point throughout this conversation, right, is that it can be dangerous for us to align our feelings to who we are as X or X and Y, because then it can be problematic for us to open ourselves up to other people's feelings, right? To understanding others' feelings and others' viewpoints. If we think that what we feel is who we are, right? Because then the other people's feelings might feel like an attack on who we are as a person, rather than just a conversation about our different perspectives and our different feelings.
Right.
Is that sort of
Right. Absolutely.
something you would
Yes.
agree
Yeah.
with?
I'm really. I apologize deeply for the fact that my internet appears to have been taken over by gremlins. But I think that just the main point of just, you know, feeling we're not going to subsume or overcome our feelings, but our feelings are just a part of how we think about the world and our own place in it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Jane, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to the participants and their wonderful questions. And as a reminder, thank you to our sponsors, the Women's Rights Law Reporter, Institute for Women's Leadership, and the Political Science Graduate Student Association. We truly value all of your input. And this was an amazing conversation. Thank you again to the Gambaccini Civic Engagement Series for this wonderful time with New York Times staff writer Jane Coaston.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.